Thursday lunchtime lecture from us here at the Church Conservation Trust. It's wonderful to be talking to you all today, and thank you for joining us. So as we started last week, we normally like to kick off these lectures now with a quick chat about a particular church in our care. So I'm going to hand you over now to our Chief Executive, Peter Rez, who's going to tell you a bit more about the church that we've selected to talk to you a bit more about this week. Over to you, Peter.
Thanks, George. And there was me expecting a good interrogation from George with some good questions to lead in, but we can roll with that. That's okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our lunchtime lecture. Now, today's lunchtime lecture is all about Episcopal Palaces. And last time I checked, the Church's Conservation Trust didn't own any Episcopal Palaces, so we've stretched a point possibly beyond the elasticity of the point, but we came up with something we thought you might enjoy. Just to remind you all, we're a charity who care for over 350, we care for 356 historic churches across England, and we take on about 2 or 3 more every year. We look at these all over England, and this time we are going to look at St Mary Magdalene in Croom. Now, the reason we selected this is that it sits in a landscape near Croom Court in Croom in Worcestershire. And well, Croom's sort of like a palace, so I suppose that's how we got this. Now, this sits in a landscape designed by Capability Brown. I'm sure lots of you have heard of Lancelot Capability Brown. And I think this was the first landscape project that he did. And Croom was his first major architectural project as well. Now, the church exterior was designed by Lancelot Brown, and the interiors were by the extremely famous Robert Adam, and were completed in 1736, and that was when this church was consecrated. Now, it was built by some of the finest craftsmen in England, and every detail has been considered, from the pretty plaster mouldings right through to the handsome carved pews. The church is a perfect representation of the period, with elegant Gothic with a definite K, windows and plasterwork, pulpit, communion rails, commandments and creed boards. Here's a view of the house with the church in the background. This house is run by our sister charity, that slightly smaller National Trust, you might have heard of them. But when you go to this landscape, don't forget that you can contribute to the work of the Church's Conservation Trust in the church as well, because it isn't covered in the membership for your National Trust when you go into the park. But here you can see the interior of the building with those fantastic pews and the pulpit and the monuments. And the chancel takes up quite a bit of space in here. This is due to the opulent monuments, which I hope you can see. You can see some of them here, and these come from the medieval church, which show some of the former barons and earls of Coventry in their full glory. The right side of the altar is the earliest monument, a black and white marble memorial that shows the first Baron Coventry, Thomas Coventry, who died in 1639, reclining under a canopy. He does look very, very calm. And he'd been Lord Keeper of the Great Seal. His effigy is shown reclined between statues personifying justice, holding the Great Seal, and virtue. The monument to Thomas Coventry, first Earl of Coventry, who died in 1699, is missing because the second Earl disapproved of his father's second marriage at an advanced age to a servant, Elizabeth Graham. His monument is now in the nearby church of St Mary's at Elmley Castle instead. Elsewhere in the church is a memorial to the 4th Baron, John Coventry, who died in 1687. It shows him reclining on a sarcophagus, reaching towards a figure of faith. John Coventry, 4th Baron Coventry of Aylesborough, was born on the 2nd of September 1654 at Croom. He was baptised on the 17th of September 1654, and he died on the 25th of July 1687 at the age of 32 and was unmarried. This monument was formerly in the crypt of St Martin in the Fields in London and was brought here in 1915. This building was closed formally for worship in 30th of October 1973 and was vested in the Church's Conservation Trust in 1975. So it's a very early vesting from the Church's Conservation Trust, but it's certainly worth a visit and understanding a bit more about that, about the story of the family there as well. So that's today's church. When you can get out, do go and have a look. It's well worth a visit.
Thank you so much, Peter. Peter, we just got time for a quick question. We've had a couple that came in last week. So one of them was, do we actually ever return any of our churches back to regular public use? Sorry, public worship?
Well, that's a good question. And yes, the answer is yes. And we've done it on 3 occasions, two of which I know about quite well. One was St Luke's Oseney Crescent in Kentish Town in London, which was returned to regular worship. And the other one is St James's at Toxteth in Liverpool. And we are, we're always open to the idea that they come back as places of worship as well, because there's no problem with that. We're talking on a number of other places as to whether they're suitable locations. Also, we have a Romanian Orthodox church worshipping in one of our churches in Brent, and I think we also are talking to another Orthodox church in Colchester about potentially them using a site as well. So they are used, and as I always say, a historic parish church, one of the best uses you can find for them is Christian worship.
Thanks, Peter. And we've just, obviously, for everyone joining there, we've just been talking about St Mary Magdalene at Croom, which is on the estate of Croom Court, which is under the care of the National Trust, but the church is under our care and protection. Peter, do we have any other cases in our care where we've got churches on large country estates?
Oh yeah, we've got several knocking around on large country estates, and you've really put me on the spot because I've got to try and remember where they are now. There's several up north where that happens, and it was quite a good thing. One of the ones nearer me is I've just completely forgotten the name of it. It's just completely gone out of my head. Isn't that terrible? Here's all these people expecting an erudite lecture, and I've completely forgotten the name of one of our churches, which is a tricky one. Bear with me, I'll come back.
It's not going to be Kedleston, is it, Peter? I've just been writing about Kedleston, but I know certainly up north we've got some really fantastic monuments in some of the churches, and I know it's the estate where they film Emmerdale is one of ours as well. Not the estate, the church there, but certainly on the National Trust, Kedleston is one of ours, and it's got some amazing monuments inside to the Curzon family.
Yeah, I've just remembered that what I was talking about was Holdenby House, Holdenby Church, which is still in family ownership on that estate, and we own the church, which is very close to the house itself, and a good partnership with the family there, where we care for the church, and they obviously have got this big house to take care of and let the public in, and they very helpfully opened the church for us as well.
Thanks, Peter. Well, everyone, as I said, this was the second time we've done this, so we're going to. The more and more we do it, the more questions we're going to be exploring through these sort of short 10-minute introductions. So if you've got any questions for our Chief Executive, please comment away, and I will try and put them to Peter next week, or if not, we'll try and make a social media post where he answers them in a long post. So either comment below, or you can send me an email, and you can email me at digital@thecct.org.uk. So if you've got any questions you'd like us to explore about churches, or any questions particularly about what we do as a charity, this is a great opportunity for you to ask us. But thank you ever so much, everyone, for listening to this introduction. So we're going to move on now to the main event, which is today we're talking about Grand Designs, the secret lives of Episcopal Palaces with Lisa McIntyre. Before we go in, a warm welcome to everyone who's joining us for the very first time today. You're most welcome. These lectures are always free of charge. We do not charge an entry fee, or you don't have to buy a ticket to attend these live streams. They're always free of charge. And we record them, and they are always made available free of charge as well to watch. So you can watch them on our Facebook or on YouTube afterwards. If you are joining us again for the first time, you'll know that you won't know that each week we offer a special membership offer to those of you who join us and want to support us in caring for historic churches. Now, for £3.50, from £3.50 a month, you can be a member with us, and your support is greatly appreciated. Now, we used to offer the Beautiful Churches book, but can you believe it? We have run out because so many people have been so kind and generous in supporting us. So what we're doing now is, if you join us by direct debit, you won't get one, you won't get two, but you'll get three amazing books about 3 historic churches in our care. I don't have enough arms, I'm afraid, to hold each one up, but you'll be getting a book about Cambridge All Saints, which is, for those of you who joined us last week, was the church, is the church we spoke about in our 10-minute introduction. Also, You'll be learning about St. John on the Wall on Bristol, which is the last surviving medieval church on the wall in Bristol. So that's a great one. And the other one you'll be learning about is Holy Trinity, York, which has some really interesting connections. And for those of you who watched the BBC series Gentleman Jack, it was filmed there. So if you join us by £3.50 a month by direct debit, you will get those for free of charge. Now, there's other ways you can support us, and that's by making a donation through our website or by sending a text message. So you can text us to text CCT to 70331 to give us a gift of £3. Now, finally, for those of you who did join us last week, I know a lot of you have been emailing me asking if you can get a copy of the book from last week. Now, we did sell out of this book, which is Arts and Crafts Churches, but I'm very pleased to say that we have been able to secure a few more copies. They are en route to us, but I'm afraid we've been selling them and we've only got around 20 copies left. So if you'd like to get a copy of this, we'll post a link now and you'll be able to buy a copy of that. So it's £35 plus postage and packaging. The RRP for this is £45, so it's a £10 discount if you buy it with us. But that's enough for me. I'm going to quickly pass you back to Peter Reyes, who's going to introduce our lecturer for today.
Great, thank you. Before I do that, I'd like to recover from my stage fright earlier, where I didn't mention the church estates, which, George, we hadn't rehearsed, I hasten to add, so it was putting me on the spot there. But there is another fantastic building at Skelton-cum-Newby, near Newby Hall, of Christ the Consoler. And at some point, I hope this will be Church of the Week, so we can tell you the story of what happened to Fred. It's quite a tragic story. I'm afraid you'll have to hold on to your emotions through it. But basically, his mum built a church in memory of him, which is fantastic. So we'll come back to that. But let's move on to today, which is all about Episcopal Palaces, which we've already established. The CCT don't own any of these at the moment. I'm sure, I don't really think we want to. We've got enough parish churches to look after. So today we've got Lisa McIntyre, who I'm pleased to say is a member of the Institute of Historic Building Conservation, like myself. And Lisa studied building conservation at the Architectural Association and specialises in ecclesiastical architecture, which is a jolly good job, because at the moment she is the church buildings team leader for the Anglican Diocese of Leeds. No small job indeed, a fantastic collection of buildings that they look after up there. Previously, she's worked with the Church Buildings Council and as a heritage consultant in the private sector. So I think you're going to go on a fantastic tour of Episcopal Palaces, and I do hope you enjoy it. Lisa, thank you for doing this, and over to you.
Thanks, Peter. And thank you for having me. Like, as you've said, my day job is dealing with church buildings. So this is a bit of a tangent to go off on Bishop's Palaces, but it's great to be able to support the Churches Conservation Trust, because in my job, we do have to make difficult decisions about churches and what happens to them. And it's reassuring that an organisation like Churches Conservation Trust is out there to take on some of the best of them and keep them open for public access. So it's a privilege to be here. So what I'm planning to do is basically to chart a bit of the history of the Episcopal Palaces of England from the medieval period and onwards, going through a bit of a general history on them and focusing in on a few examples of them. And I'm kind of hoping this will be of interest to anyone interested in church architecture, because that story of the palaces is the story of the bishops, the story of the church. So it's a kind of social history that also affected churches and their development. And the buildings are also a charting of English architectural history in a similar way that church architecture is. So there's definitely parallels and interest there, even though it might at first flush seem a bit of a tangent to churches. So I'll start sharing my screen. So the medieval bishops, they were, as today, the most senior members of the church. They were responsible for overseeing clergy. They were responsible for the administration of the diocese and all the estates. But they differed from today's bishops because of the differing position of the church within society. So obviously the church and religion was central to society back in the medieval period. The monarch was, had the divine right to rule, and then the bishops and the clergy were the spokespeople for God to the people. So due to the central position of the church in society, the bishops were incredibly influential people. So they had the pastoral and charitable role, they had the judicial and administrative role, but they were also like really political back in those days. So they were particularly selected for association with the crown, like their position close to the crown. So if they had provided political and military service to the crown, they found favor and were appointed. So as whereas today, it's more about the religious aspect. Back then, it was about who you were and who you knew. So their administrative and judicial roles required them to move a lot around the diocese, to supervise clergy, to check in on the management of the diocesan estate and the money coming in from the diocesan estate, to undertake church court, to trial people that had been behaving badly under church law. And their political role required them to attend Parliament, so go down to London. And many bishops also had other administrative roles relating to the royal court. So they were on the move a lot. And to enable this movement, each diocese had several houses at a time when travel wasn't quick and easy. You couldn't just pop on the train from the north down to London. They had to be able to stay and spend time with each part of their diocese. So there would be one bishop's palace in the cathedral city. There would be numerous ones spread across the diocese, which varied depending on the size and wealth of the diocese. And there would also be a bishop's palace in London. And Lambeth Palace, shown here, is probably a well-known one because it still exists today, and it is still the Archbishop of Canterbury's residence today. It is the one surviving one, probably because the Archbishop of Canterbury has maintained a position of power, even though it's changed. He's still a relevant and central person in the life of England. So he probably managed to be saved from having his palace seized by the crown or anyone else over time. Lambeth Palace is interesting as well because it's situated right across the Thames from the Houses of Parliament. So it really is an illustration, a physical illustration of that connection of church and state. The favoured residence of the bishop varied in each diocese. So they had many to choose from, and each bishop would have his favourite one. But there did tend to be one that did settle down to become the most used one by each bishop. So these were often close to the cathedral city, but not in the cathedral city, because the cathedral is run by the dean and chapter. So it's got this whole own administration system, and the bishop sometimes wanted to keep out of that a bit, but it needed to be convenient for him to get into the cathedral city. So one example that is close to the cathedral city, but not in the cathedral city, is Bishopthorpe, which is still the Archbishop of York's residence today. It doesn't look it from this facade because it's been redeveloped over the years, but this dates back to the 1220s. So when the Bishop Walter de Grey acquired the manor and started building his palace there. It's not the oldest residence of the Archbishops of York, but there was one next to the cathedral, but that gradually went into disuse as Bishopthorpe became more used and more popular, and by the Reformation, the Bishop's Palace in the city had gone. So Bishop Grey actually vested ownership of this manor in the cathedral and chapter, which was a kind of wise move. So they were the perpetual trustees, but he got to use it because there was a practice kind of started by Henry II of sometimes keeping a diocese vacant intentionally so that the royal exchequer could draw in the money from the estate. So investing the manor in the cathedral, the money stayed in the diocese. There was a lot of game playing between like court and between church and the monarch and everything at these times. You had to watch your step quite carefully. Another residence close to the cathedral city, but not in it, is Hartlebury, which is 10 miles from the cathedral city of Worcester. So this was thought to have been granted to the bishopric in the Anglo-Saxon period. So I'm focusing from the medieval onwards. This predates that. But the first record of construction of Worcester was in the mid-13th century. again, there was the Bishop's Palace in the diocese, in the city of Worcester as well, which is shown here. It sits alongside the river. This is the river side front. And that was in use at the same time. That was first constructed around 1200, was its original origins, and it remained in use as Hartlebury was used at the same time. And there was actually quite a bit of shifting between these two, because this stayed as a bishop's residence until the 19th century. So the placement of palaces and the money put into them could also be used by bishops to make a point and to shift a power focus. So, for example, the Anglo-Saxon bishops in the area of Somerset were the bishops of Wells, but Bishop John of Tours became the first bishop of Bath in 1090. However, Bishop Jocelyn, about a century later, was a native of Wells and had been a canon at the cathedral. So he was determined to return Wells' status as the episcopal centre of that diocese. So in order to do so, he obtained royal permission to enclose the deer park just next to the cathedral, and he erected a house there that would come to be the bishop's principal residence. So that is one example actually where the one in the cathedral city did become the principal residence. But back to the number of palaces, many bishops had existing family wealth, because to get close to the monarch, to succeed in the church, to progress in the church, they had to have a good start and be quite influential already. So many of them already had their own wealth, which was added to the wealth of the diocese in order to build the palaces. And so, but the wealth varied widely across the country, and different dioceses had different amounts of land and different wealth. So Winchester was one of the wealthiest dioceses, and it also had a bishop in the early medieval period who was a really keen builder and patron of the arts, whose name was Henry de Blois. He was there from around 1129. And he was also the abbot of Glastonbury, so bishops could hold multiple posts at this time. So he had access to the money from Glastonbury Abbey and its holdings. He was official representative of the Pope in England. He was the brother of King Stephen. He was incredibly influential and incredibly wealthy, so he had a lot of money to play with. He built Farnham Castle in Surrey, the remains of which can be seen here. He built Taunton Castle in Somerset, Swainston Manor on the Isle of Wyatt. All of these still exist in some form today, but there were many, many more, and Winchester was thought to have about 75 manor houses by the late medieval period. Bishops of Durham are also worth mentioning. They were incredibly powerful because the county of Durham had its own jurisdiction, a lot of liberty and authority outside the control of the crown. So they basically had autonomy, a lot of autonomy, and the bishop was given powers of taxation, right to rule over secular court matters as well as the church court matters. Durham is not in the Domesday Book because they weren't subject to the same taxation. So the bishop, about a century later, did his own round to find out who owned what and what he could claim. So the power and wealth of the bishops, because they were such, was on par with the nobility. And so they were similar to the nobility in setting trends in architecture, and similar in other, as churches set trends in church architecture and were a display of the progress. Bishops' palaces had that as well. There seems to have been little to distinguish between bishops' palaces and those of nobility, but one area where there is some differentiation is around the chapel. So a bishop had to have a chapel, he still does today. And nobility would have had chapels as well, but the thing that differentiates the bishops' palaces in several instances is that they frequently had two-story chapels, so with the lower level being vaulted. It's not quite known exactly how the two different spaces were used, and there's not much in the way of written evidence on this, but it's thought that the undercroft may have served as a secondary chapel, potentially for the lesser members of the household, so the servants that would have had to support the bishop. And a late 19th century historian, in talking about the chapel at Bishopthorpe, which is shown here, this is a 13th century chapel, which is over 2 levels, with the main chapel being at the top level. His explanation was that consecration extended from the earth to the sky, and the existence of bedrooms above or a larder below would have been thought a desecration. So you had to have chapels on both levels. Another late 19th century historian in recording Lambeth Palace thought that the undercroft at Lambeth might have been where the court was held. Not sure what his basis was for that, but it's an interesting supposition. The one at Lambeth Palace still remains in its 13th century form today, and the undercroft, but the upper bit has been developed on many occasions, including after bomb damage in the Second World War. Another two-storey chapel can be seen at Ely Place in London, which is now St Etheldreda's Roman Catholic Church, so that's accessible to the public. Some other two-storey chapels have been destroyed, such as the one at Hereford Castle. Hereford Castle still exists, but the chapel has been replaced. And at Bishop Waltham in the Diocese of Winchester, which is only ruins now. But the semi-sunken undercroft can be parts of that remain, and you can see the central column that supported the vaulting, so that structure of the building was clear. At Auckland Castle, Bishop of Durham's castle, the original two-storey chapel was also destroyed, but recent archaeological investigations relating to development there has uncovered the foundations and remains of that. And there was great excitement about that a few years ago because it was an extensive, huge building. So they found foundations of walls that were 1.5 meters thick with a large tower flanking either side of the entrance. They found the buttresses, the internal columns, the bases of them. So they can really get a picture of what that building would have looked like and at scale. And it would have been the largest building at the castle and around 12 meters wide and 40 meters long. Another amazing early chapel, which I couldn't get an open source picture of, and lockdown scuppered my plans to move around and get one, is at Durham Castle. So the undercroft survives of that chapel, and it's an absolutely astonishing Norman structure with this beautiful carving. It looks fabulous, and so I recommend looking it up after the lecture because I can't show it to you myself. At Worcester Palace, which has been mentioned, there's a first floor chapel there still surviving. The palace was started in the 13th century. The medieval chapel was truncated to just be the chancel, so it would have been much bigger back in the day, but mid-16th century bishop shortened it and reorientated it, so it's now worship facing south, which is unorthodox. The panelling to be seen here is around mid-17th century. And sneak inside another chapel. This is at Wolsey, the Bishop of Winchester's palace. So this remains his private residence and chapel. And so this was over 2 stories as well. You can see the stairs going up to the chapel on the left there and the chapel itself on the right. It's thought to date to around the mid-15th century, and that's been further altered subsequently, but it's presumed to be on the foundations of the Norman chapel by Henry de Blois, so suggesting that it's been 2 stories since the outset as well. There are several examples of other chapels that are simply substantial single-story structures. A significant example remaining virtually unaltered is that at Wells Palace in Somerset. So on the picture on the left there, you can see the outside of the chapel on the left-hand side, and then the interior. The list description states the chapel here as being an important element in the development of the decorated style of the late 13th century, which again is emphasizing that point about how the bishop's palaces, like the churches, are really crucial and really valuable survivals to aid our understanding of English architectural history. Halls were another key part of residence. So bishops had to offer hospitality to visitors, so would have had grand central halls in common with the houses of nobility, and they needed to be prepared for royalty to visit, like nobility needed to be prepared, and there are various records of royals staying at bishops' palaces down the centuries. This is Wells, shown here, where again Bishop Jocelyn constructed this in from the 1220s over 2 stories. So a hall which can be seen on the right over a vaulted undercroft. Later that century, so later 13th century, a subsequent bishop, Burnell, built a larger hall of similar height, overall height, but comprising 1 story at right angles to the original hall. So this was a step towards a courtyard layout, which many palaces moved towards as they were reconstructed to enable more separation between public and private as trends in domestic living changed. The bishop's palaces responded to that. And this image is, you can see there on the left, the original hall, which is on the left, then the chapel in the middle, and then the remains of the hall built by Bishop Burnell, which is now it fell into disrepair and has now deliberately been turned into a romantic ruin and folly. Whereas the original survives, although as can be seen, there's like now a spine wall down the middle, and it's obviously been completely redone, especially that upper one on the right-hand side. This is the hall at Worcester, Worcester Palace. So again, it's over 2 stories with the vaulted ground floor space and the hall above. And this dates to the second half of the 13th century. Bishop Thorpe has similar, dating to the beginning of the 13th century. Whereas Hartlebury, the Bishop of Worcester's other palace, is a grand, lofty single-story structure built in the 15th century. So this could have also been the development and possibilities around structures and how high you could build without, columns in the middle and all that kind of stuff. It shows that progress. There would have also needed to be many support buildings for offering this hospitality, bakehouses, brew houses, etc. The Great Kitchen at Chichester Palace still stands today, dating back to the 13th century. So that's just a general view on the left and the kitchen on the right. There would have been productive gardens, deer parks for the supply of food. Bishop Thorpe documents sheepfold, woods, fish ponds, and a watermill. There are deer parks known to be at Auckland and Farnham, and there would have been many others beside, which would have provided food, but also entertainment for visiting guests, because bishops liked to hunt as nobles like to hunt. The bishop's judicial role would have needed to have been accommodated. As already mentioned, Lambeth Palace has kind of suggested that the court might have been underneath the chapel, and they would have needed to provide those spaces as well. The accommodation for all the staff alongside, so this would have been the standard type of servants, but bishops also needed to take with them their chancellor, the judge of the diocese, the registrar, the chief administrator. All these people would have needed accommodation. Some residences included prisons for holding clerics who were convicted under church law. This judicial and prison function was particularly relevant at Durham Castle, which has already been mentioned. They had extra powers, so they had secular powers of court, so would have been imprisoning normal people under normal law as well. Not that clerics aren't normal, but and there was a whole suite of functions at a whole suite of buildings at Durham to provide for these functions, which were developed over time. Hereford Castle had prison cells in the castle as well. This was particularly notorious in the 14th century because there was some haziness over how far the bishop's jurisdiction went. So it would usually be confined to the cathedral close, but it spread further in the city. And so the bishop's bailiffs would go out arresting and imprisoning people who had misbehaved under secular law. But he apparently was entitled to do so. They had to go to the Crown on several occasions and say, no, he's allowed to do that. But it was very controversial. It was a bit notorious there. So the palaces also had defensive features such as crenellations, sturdy boundary walls, gatehouses, moats. The moats might have been largely picturesque, where meanwhile the crenellations were a display of power and royal trust and support, because you needed a license from the crown in order to build a defense around your manor house. Some examples, again, we go back to Wells, where license to crenellate was granted, and the moat was formed by diverting the natural springs which stand within the castle walls as well, and which are the springs that give Wells its name. At Worcester as well, license was granted to fortify and embattle Hartlebury, and it incorporates a moat. There are several other examples as well. These are just a mere few. While there's some suggestion that the defences of these residences were primarily just for show, an architectural demonstration of privilege, the history of the castles does show that they were needed on several occasions at numerous sites. So the medieval bishops, like medieval kings, did go to war. Henry de Blois of Winchester played an active part in warfare, sometimes against his king, his brother King Stephen, sometimes with him. Durham was fortified as well. So the bishop with his extra powers had the power to raise an army. So he needed to accommodate them. The palace came under attack on several occasions, and they did manage to fight off attackers due to the fortifications. So when it was originally built, and some of this survives today, it had two massive towers at the entrance, the Norman keep on the motte or mound, as shown here, all united by a curtain wall marked with round turrets, and they needed these defences. Down in the south, there was a threat from France. Up in the north, there was a threat from the Scots. This is Rose Castle, which was for a long time the principal residence of the bishops of Carlisle. It was sacked and burnt down twice just in the early 14th century. Following this, it was rebuilt, basically the present building, although it's been altered. So in the 1330s, it was rebuilt around 5 sides, so a very inward-looking defensive building. And that tower on the right there is one of the early towers that survives. The rest of it, much of it's been pulled down and then redeveloped in the Victorian period to be a much cleaner, nicer version of Gothic there. But the original building was very much a defensive building. It had a mantle wall, a defensive mantle wall as well. And most of this survives, although it's been cut down to enable these nice terrace gardens, because there's no longer that same defense needed. Even the palaces that weren't in dangerous locations benefited from the existence of defensive structures at times of civil unrest. 1381 was a bad year to be a bishop because the peasants revolted following the passing of a third poll tax in less than 5 years. The bishops came under attack as they were part of society's elite, and many of them were expressly in support of the tax, so they did have to hide away inside their castles. Post-medieval period, there was less movement of bishops by the 16th century, and there was some abandonment of the outmoded buildings and focusing in on fewer. This focus led to improvements and rebuilding at many existing sites. There was quite a lot of development in the 16th century, including at Maidstone and at Knoll, both manor houses of the Archbishops of Canterbury. During the Reformation, some sites were taken over by the Crown, both the manor houses and the associated land, not only leading to the loss of the palaces themselves, but loss of income and reduced ability to build and maintain lavishly. The land wasn't uniformly seized by force, but due to the position of the church being volatile at the time and bishops' positions being reliant on having good relationships with the Crown, bishops did find themselves having to particularly submit to the Crown with requests to take over property. At Knoll, this got the attraction of Henry VIII and was handed over to the Crown and then sold on. So it had been recently done over, it was looking great. It had a deer park. Henry VIII loved hunting. You can see why it came to his attention and why he wanted it. So this is Knoll illustrated there. Many of the London houses were also handed over at this time as valuable to the Crown. This included Ely's Palace, which is near Holborn, so close to Hatton Garden. And Sir Christopher Hatton took a shine to it and said to Queen Elizabeth, "Can you sort me out a lease for that?" And the bishop was reluctant, but was won over by threats. Apparently the rent for the palace was 1 red rose at midsummer, and the grounds was 10 loads of hay plus £10 yearly. The bishop retained the free access through the gate and the right to walk in the gardens and gather 2 bushels of roses each summer. I don't know if this is true, but it sounds lovely. Well, it's a nice story. The lease was extended after the first 21 years. Again, the bishop wasn't happy. Again, Queen Elizabeth threatened him. And apparently there is a letter still existing where she basically said, "I've made you, and if you do not instantly comply, by God, I will defrock you." So Ely Palace was no longer in the possession of the bishops, and it was quite quickly redeveloped, and only the chapel stands now today. Queen Elizabeth effectively used blackmail for a lot of bishops around the country, refusing to sanction appointments if they didn't hand over property. James I put a bit of a stop to that and didn't pass the law that didn't allow the crown to claim episcopal land. However, then the Civil War happened. And this had a significant impact on the course of the history of many of the palaces. At least 19 major residences were severely damaged or completely ruined. At Auckland Castle, Bishop of Durham's residence, this was sold to a parliamentarian. The survey at the time called it a very stately manor house and referred to the two chapels, one over the other, which have already been mentioned. The parliamentarians destroyed the defensive capabilities of many castles, but here the new occupant, who was the northern governor of Cromwell's army, destroyed the chapel, which would seem a pretty clear statement against the church and the power of the prince bishops. When it was returned to the bishops, however, the existing late 12th century Great Hall was repurposed as the chapel by the newly appointed Bishop Cousin. So with the addition of a clerestory, which can be seen in that picture on the left, and this fantastic screen inside the chapel as well, as perhaps a fitting retaliation that this once again became the grandest building at the palace. Hartlebury was a stronghold for royalists and was attacked by parliamentarians. So those fortifications mentioned before were a worthwhile measure, although they did only manage to hold out for 2 days, and the palace was left ruinous, except for the keep, which did remain. But when they redeveloped it when it returned to the bishops after the Civil War, they ended up demolishing the keep anyway, but they did keep the 15th century hall, which is in the centre there and which I showed a picture of earlier. The new castle was built on a kind of U plan and with a castellated boundary wall closing off the rest of the quadrangle. So it was still within a moat, but it was kind of lost its defensive air. It didn't have the keep anymore. It had some castellations, but it wasn't that kind of robust castle of the past. In the Diocese of Winchester during the Civil War, Farnham Castle, Bishop Waltham and Wolsey in the city of Winchester all came under attack. After the war, Farnham was restored, but Bishop Waltham was used for materials in the building of a new Wolsey. It was a completely new building, basically. A Baroque palace was built alongside the ruins of the castle, but they did incorporate that chapel, which you saw earlier. That was the one bit that was kind of built into the new fabric, and the rest of it remains in ruins and can be visited. Fulham Palace, one of the country houses of the Bishop of London, also briefly left Bishop's hands. So the Bishop's main residence was by St. Paul's Cathedral, but Fulham was a significant manor house with a long history. It was handed over to the bishopric in the late 7th century, and there are records of one monk bishop being taken prisoner there under King Stephen in the 12th century. Bishop Walter de Grey, Archbishop of York, mentioned earlier, died there in 1255 when attending Parliament when he fell unwell, apparently just due to stress by the sounds of it. This was a classic example of a palace that had been redeveloped around courtyard structure, and it has 2 courtyards. This is one of them. The deed of sale gives some description of the land, which gives some insight. So it's 36.5 acres. There was 1 private chapel, all buildings, outhouses, dovehouses, barns, stables, granaries, coach houses, courts, courtyards, orchards, gardens, walks, fish ponds, watercourses, 2 footbridges, 1 great bridge, 3 closes of pasture called the Warren, all encompassed by a moat. Gives a good illustration. So new sites weren't really known after this period, but there were some extensive rebuilds of existing and substantial additions, again, in the Georgian and Victorian periods. When Fulham was, because Fulham was handed over to the parliamentarians rather than putting up a fight, it probably was safe from the same kind of damages that occurred at some of those Winchester palaces. But it was still deemed old and ruinous by a bishop of the early 18th century when he was looking to kind of relocate out of the centre of London and potentially to Fulham. a survey was commissioned, and it was concluded that the demolition of parts would be necessary, and it would be possible because after demolition there would still be 50 or 60 rooms aside from the chapel and the Great Hall and the kitchen, so there was still a lot there to work with. Interesting to note, some of the commissioners of the survey were Christopher Wren and John Vanbrugh. The next bishop, after the one that demolished the lot and moved back in, repaired the hall and built the great dining room there. The library was also built at Fulham, which is actually shown on the right here, sorry, confusingly. Going to talk about the right-hand picture first. It was built to house the collection of Bishop Porteous, who said of the palace that there wants nothing but a good library to make it a complete episcopal mansion. So he drew up the plans for one, but it was actually his successor in the early 19th century that ended up getting around to building it. It was built on the site of the chapel, which meant that the hall had to be repurposed as a chapel. Several residences had libraries added in the 18th and early 19th centuries, including Rose and Hartlebury. Hartlebury is shown there on the left. It dates to the 1780s. It's particularly noted and celebrated, not just for the architecture, but for the fact that the collection left by Bishop Hurd remains complete today and in the location for which it was built. So that's significant. Although bishops have always been learned men, they perhaps did not have substantial personal collections of books before this period, or if they did, they were not inclined to put them on open display. Also, they had to move around a lot, so establishing a library wasn't really a feasible thing to do. But it is interesting to note how the increase of dedicated libraries for bishops coincides with the general trends in country houses in the 18th century to put one's learnedness on display. So it's again them keeping pace with the aristocracy. Another way in which they did that was in this period there are several noted architects involved in works at bishops' palaces. So bishops still maintain that influence, importance, and wealth to be able to secure those services. At Hartlebury, this chapel of around 1750 is by Henry Keene, who was responsible for several churches, including Shobden Church, and he also worked at Westminster Abbey. The list description here particularly highlights the work at Hartlebury as being one of the most significant works of the Gothic revival. It predates Strawberry Hill, which is basically the poster child for Gothic with a K. Another architect who connects Westminster Abbey and Bishops' Palaces is James Wyatt. He worked extensively across the University of Oxford, numerous cathedrals, numerous churches, and he was also commissioned by the royal family to enlarge and improve Frogmore House. So this bishops and royal connection is maintained again, bishops keeping up with the royals, even as Wyatt was commissioned by the Bishop of Durham to remodel parts of Auckland Castle in the last decade of the 18th century. At Rose Castle, Thomas Rickman was brought in to modernise the buildings under the direction of Bishop Percy in the late 1830s. Rickman is of particular note for anyone interested in church architecture, as it's he who defined the classifications that are still used to describe the periods of English Gothic architecture today. In his publication called An Attempt to Discriminate the Styles of Architecture in England from the Conquest to the Reformation. So when we use the terms Norman, Early English, Decorated and Perpendicular, we're using Rickman's definitions and language. So the stateroom, the chapel and entrance hall, here's the chapel at Rose, were all remodeled internally and externally by Rickman. Notable architects of the Victorian period involved at Bishops' Palaces include William Butterfield, who designed a copious number of church buildings, often highly ornate, and was particularly associated with the Oxford movement. He was responsible for the building of a new purpose-built chapel at Fulham in 1866, shown here on the left. So you'll recall that the previous chapel was replaced by the library and the chapel had to move to the hall. This enabled the hall to resume its original use. So we had a purpose-built chapel here by Butterfield. In Lincoln, meanwhile, the palace adjacent to the cathedral was redeveloped with input from both Ewan Christian and the practice of Bodley and Garner, making use of part of the remains of the medieval palace, which were in ruins, and an 18th century residence, which was already in the ownership of the bishop. Christian's work was undertaken at the same time that Butterfield was working at Fulham, but it was not until the last decade of the 19th century, under Bishop Edward King, that the further works were undertaken with the intention of becoming the bishop's principal residence again. This decision was made as Fulham Palace on the outskirts of the city was inconvenient for the clergy, and Bishop King wanted to be more accessible. Bodley was responsible for the chapel shown here. It's situated above a medieval undercroft and linked by the remains of a medieval spiral staircase. Much of the medieval ruins is still remaining today and can be visited, including those of the Great Hall. An early 20th century account describes the palace at Lincoln, saying perhaps the most beautiful part of the palace is the domestic chapel. Within it is decked with all the skill of a modern craftsman. And though it must lack much of the colour, yet it may be that it exceeds in dignity the desecrated chapel that lies below. A brief word about the grounds of the palaces. In the post-medieval period, they became places of pleasure and entertainment, or in the case of Fulham, as shown here, a collection of rare plants and trees under Bishop Compton, who was a keen botanist. Compton was suspended from his duties for a time by James II as he refused to inhibit the rector of St. Giles in the Fields for preaching against Catholicism. So he just retreated to his palace and spent time in his garden, and it became much celebrated. At Wells, meanwhile, Bishop Law put significant work into the garden in the 1820s with that picturesque ruin, as previously mentioned. So money was still going into the palaces at this time. However, there was a wider change happening. In 1832, the Reform Bill was passing through Parliament, which was going to increase the number of people eligible to vote and add new seats to the House of Commons from areas where population growth had been experienced, particularly working class industrial cities. Almost all of the bishops opposed this when it came to the House of Lords, and there were attacks on many bishops and palaces as a result, including the burning of the residence at Bristol. At Farnham Castle, the people marched to the entrance of the castle, but the gates were too well fortified and still maintained, so they had to march back into town and burn an effigy instead, and this happened in several locations. So the church increasingly recognized that it had to do something to act to remove some of the inequalities inherent within the diocese and the spread of wealth and the disconnect of the church with the people. One step was the formation in 1836 of the Ecclesiastical Commissioners to introduce a fairer system of management and redistribution of diocesan finances. The residences of the bishops would remain with the diocese for the time being, but the commissioners would bring in management measures, working towards the aim of there being only one per diocese. Prior to this, a bill had been passed which enabled land and endowments to be surrendered by bishops and cathedral chapters. Bishop William van der Mildert of Durham used this opportunity to found the University of Durham in 1832 and bequeathed the castle to the newly established university at his death. Initially, the bishop still held the castle and associated buildings in its precinct in trust for the University of Durham to enable the functions under his special jurisdiction to carry on in those buildings. But around the same time, those special privileges and jurisdiction that he had were vested back in the crown, ending the rule of the prince bishops. This is an unnecessarily moody and lovely picture of Durham Castle, but it's got good atmosphere. You can't see much, but good atmosphere. At Worcester, meanwhile, the Bishop's Palace was sold to the Cathedral Dean and Chapter in 1846 and became the deanery, with Hartlebury becoming the main residence. So there was this increasing giving away of land and residences. The ecclesiastical commissioners were largely responsible for reducing the numbers of palaces, but they did have to add some as well. So they actually built one for the new Bishop of Ripon, which was a diocese formed in 1836. And this was kind of unusual. They commissioned William Railton, who also designed Nelson's Column and several churches, to build a new building. Mostly they just bought new houses which were not existing parts of the church portfolio, but were suitable for the modern needs of a bishop. One exception to this was at the formation of Guildford Diocese in 1927, where the Bishop of Guildford did come to occupy Farnham Castle, which was Henry de Blois' baby. In 1943, new legislation came into force which vested the ownership of all bishops' houses to the now renamed church commissioners, who would be responsible for their maintenance and make decisions over their disposal. So this happened in 1943, although by that stage, many of the palaces had already passed on to new use. Several institutions and like, so universities, schools, those kind of things. Some examples of the assessments undertaken during this period include wells. In the 1950s, it was concluded that the palace was badly planned, inconvenient, and in a state of decay. The bishop agreed, but the local public did not. So they reassessed what they were going to do. They thought about putting in a theological college there. They thought about building a separate flat for the bishop within the grounds, but this was considered too contentious. Ultimately, his quarters were just reduced to one wing to make it easier to manage. The gardens were opened up at this time to the public, and in the following decade, the staterooms were opened up as well. In Hartlebury, there was already a theological college, which was established in the early 20th century, but that wasn't enough to support the site as a whole, which was, again, deemed to be this unwieldy thing. So the post-war assessment led to the reduction of the bishop's accommodation there as well. Plans were actually drawn up involving extensive remodeling of that central hall that we saw and demolition of part of one of the wings. But there are objections from the conservation bodies, and the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings presented an alternative scheme, which was the one that was eventually adopted. So the staterooms would be open for occasional public access, while Worcester Museum services took over another part of the site. Another example at Fulham, the church commissioners decided that the buildings were unwieldy and difficult to maintain at the best of times, plus that it had suffered bomb damage. So the search began for an appropriate new location for the bishop and an appropriate new user for the palace. But these were abandoned for the time being. It's interesting, considering that they were thinking about giving up the site, that actually the artist Graham Russ was brought in to execute murals in the chapel in 1953, which can be seen here on the right. The chapel did need repair, having suffered bomb damage, but this was arguably an unnecessary luxury in the context. To divert for a moment to post-war murals, it's also worth spotlighting Chichester and the appearance of Hans Freibusch, the German Jewish emigre artist, who particularly became famous for his post-war church murals in this country. His work adorns the wall of the vaulted chapel, which dates to around 1200, and even if I do say so myself, a very fine addition. This is a bit of an indulgence for me because Freibusch is brilliant. But this is also interesting because a continuation of the bishops being patrons of arts, even in these strapped times. So for the time being, the bishops did stay at Wells, Fulham, Hartlebury and Chichester. But when the full assessment had been carried out by 1960, 19 out of the 42 diocese residences had been replaced. And frankly, none of the buildings were really secure in their continued use as bishops' palaces. The assessments and conversations have carried on since then, famously recently at Auckland Castle. Since the 1960s, the bishops have left several more of the palaces, and now only 9 of the original medieval palaces are still in use as residences. This no longer includes Hartlebury or Fulham, which were saved in the 1960s, but now the bishop has left them. Fortunately, however, many that are no longer residences of the bishops do still have access, elements of public access, so that they're arguably more open now and can be enjoyed by more these days. So that is where we come to today, the state of the bishops' palaces. Just one final word of note, the bishops have always been kind of having to give hospitality and actually have an open door, and I've been grateful to a few of the bishop's staff and diocese for supplying some of these photos, including into Wolsey and Worcester Palace, which would otherwise be not viewable by the public. So the spirit of hospitality and openness does continue.
So thank you so much, Lisa. That was absolutely breathtaking. I'm just going to stop your screen sharing here as we go into question time. I'm sure everyone will agree with me that that really was a fantastic journey through the history of a Episcopal Palaces in England. So thank you so much for taking the time to do this lecture for us. So everyone, we're about to go into question time. So if you've got any questions, now is your time to ask them. We've had quite a lot coming in already. So I'm going to jump straight in if that's okay, Lisa. So the first question, so you talked about sort of a lot of bishops invested money in building these grand palaces or fortified settlements. By investing such money, were they strengthening their tenure, or do you think they actually undermined it by spending so much money?
Oh, that's a good question. I kind of get the impression that at one point they had so much money coming in, and they own these whole manors and all, you know, there was a tithing system, so much money was coming to them that there probably wasn't much assessment needed of where they put their money. They could just afford to do it. And they did have to show hospitality and, you know, remain close to the crown and not come under threat. So in terms of the position of the bishops themselves, it was probably a good thing for them to continue to be able to offer that hospitality and wealth. But there were questions about whether it was actually appropriate for bishops to be spending such money on palaces. And there was a period where there was a stop put to it by the crown in like the 12th century. I think it was basically said, this isn't what the money is for. It's supposed to be for the public. But they did open doors to the public as well. Like there was much more of a availability of bishops as well, for people to go in.
That's really interesting, that answer there. And you earlier on talked about, especially for bishops who were travelling long distances to come to London to attend court or anything like that, there would be sort of several stops along the way. Someone's asked a question which I think links with that quite nicely. But does the place name, so if a place name, say like Bishop Stortford or something like that, if it has bishop in the place name, does it suggest that there may have been a bishop's house there? Or was it not, or was it maybe just a case that the bishop owned some land there?
I think it's a mixture. Like I haven't managed to kind of look, it would be an impossible task. There were so many. At the end of the Tudor period, there was thought to be about 177 still being used. So I don't know in each location, but it is an indicator that there could have well been a palace there. If the manor was given a bishop's name, it must have been an indication that it was a significant part of the diocese. But yeah, they're not necessarily, there's not that correlation, I don't believe.
Brilliant, thank you, Lisa. And you touched on, I was really interested because you talked about how bishops sometimes imprison clerics. And I know when I worked at the Church of England, one of the great joys was being able to go to Lambeth Palace and actually go and see the, in the tower, there's a tower attached to the palace where they used to imprison people. And also at Ely Cathedral, if you go to Ely, which is got the largest surviving monastic precincts in Europe, you actually go through one of the gatehouses is the old jail. So it's fascinating to think that these bishops had jails. And someone's asked a question, particularly about sort of punishments. And I've heard of a bishop's court. What was the function of such ecclesiastical courts, and what kind of punishments were given out after convictions? Do you know anything about this at all?
I'm afraid I don't know anything about this. I didn't go into the prisons and why people were put into prison and the extent of the punishment and the length of the punishment. So I'm afraid I don't. That's another niche subject that is not mine. It would be interesting though. It would be interesting.
No, definitely. And I know, again, when you talked about violence and bishops you know, fortifying castles, that there's a misconception there that I remember at school sort of we used to be taught that, you know, bishops were depicted, and I think it dates back to the Bayeux Tapestry. You have Bishop Odo who's depicted wielding a mace because bishops weren't meant to shed blood. But I know that's just total nonsense, because the Bishop of Norwich, and you mentioned the the peasants' revolt, not only did the Bishop of Norwich fight there, and he was documented as going in fighting the peasants with his sword. 3 years later, he went over to Flanders to suppress those following the anti-pope there. So bishops were fighting people. So this idea that they were meek and gentle just doesn't seem right, really.
It's not true.
One of the questions I think is interesting, and sort of you've touched on it a little bit, you know, that a lot of the palaces have either fallen into ruins, or some have been demolished or just altered. when the buildings were demolished, were they instances of, sorry, let me get this right. When the buildings were demolished or redeveloped, are there instances of people objecting to them being demolished or changed? Were the Victorians guilty of this?
There was, more recently, like I know when there was all the assessments going on after the establishment of the ecclesiastical commissioners, so once it was out of the hands of the diocese and more, you know, a decision for the nation, there are quite a few records of the SPAB getting involved and having stuff to say. There's been numerous articles in Country Life magazine over the years about, you know, how important these buildings are and how they need to be preserved for the nation. So yeah, since the existence of kind of conservation bodies like SPAB onwards, where there's been like that more articulation, then yeah, they've definitely taken an interest. Earlier than that, I don't know. I don't know.
Lisa, one question that's come in, and it's that they've said, I was amazed to hear you say that a chapel was designed by Henry Keane, who designed Shobden in Herefordshire. Is that an established fact? This person visited Shobden Church a few years ago, and the guidebook said the architect's identity was not known. So I'd really like your opinion on that.
Oh, I purely got some list of where Shobden had been involved by looking up the heritage list for England. I typed in to see how many listed buildings he's responsible for, and Shobden did come up. So I don't know about Shobden Church in detail myself, but yeah, so it's kind of backwards. I knew that he worked at Hartlebury Castle, and so tried to find out where else he was responsible to see what he did where. So according to the heritage list for England, he did, but I don't know.
Thank you. And we've had a couple of questions coming about the church commissioners, and what I'm going to do is, everyone, we're actually going to be starting a mini vlog series very shortly with our chief executive, and one of the things we're going to talk about is the role of the church commissioners, because it's a fantastic entity. It makes up what we call the NCIs, or the National Church Institutions, and we work very closely with the church commissioners here at the Church Conservation Trust. So we'll be actually having an episode with them, hopefully. So keep your eyes peeled, and we'll post details very shortly about when we're going to be launching those. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. I think this is a nice one. Do you have a favourite Bishop's Palace?
I anticipated that question. That question would come because it's been asked on a few lectures. I think Wells gets it really right, because it's still a bishop's residence and it's still got public access. So I think the spirit of what goes on there is fantastic, because the first time I visited Wells, I just strolled in and I ran into the bishop just coming out of the gatehouse. So there's that kind of public access to the bishops and to the church. So I think that's really good spirit, and it's a beautiful place as well. And the gardens are fantastic, and the springs and the cathedral's just there. It's really beautiful. But I also particularly like Rose Castle, because that is incredibly atmospheric. That's no longer a bishop's residence, but it's going to be a kind of conference and retreat centre. So that recently left the hands of the bishop. But that is it's up there in the north of the country, and when I was there, you're just exposed to the elements, and it just feels ancient and wonderful, but it's also like really lovely and domestic inside as well. And they apparently have a ghost there, so you know, anywhere with a ghost is a bonus.
Fantastic. Well, I've got one more question for you in a moment, but I know there's been a couple of questions also coming about when can you go and see these places? How do you go and see them? Yeah. A really good thing everyone to do is just check Heritage Open Days, because often they'll be listed on there, and that takes place in September. We're going to be taking part in that as well, so do have a look there. But for those of you who are based in the south, or anyone who comes to London, obviously you've seen Lisa mention Fulham Palace. Do go and see that. It's a really fantastic place to go and visit. Do also try, if you can, if there's a group of you going, I do believe you can still book, or you will be able to book when they reopen, tours of Lambeth Palace, and you can see the guards room, the Archbishop of Canterbury's palaces. Again, there's an upper and lower, so do go and have a look at that. But also Ely Place, which was built by the Bishop of Ely, St Etheldreda's Chapel still remains, and it is fantastic. And the stained glass window in the east window is just spectacular. So I do recommend you go and have a look at those. But final question here, Lisa.
Can I say for a few in the north? So
Oh, yeah.
Auckland Castle is open to public access. That's quite recent. That was quite a success story there when the bishop moved out. So Auckland Castle and Durham Castle run by the university, but they also have a museum in there. So that's for the north. And Hartlebury is still, that's Midlands, we'll go one for the Midlands. That is still a museum as well. So that can be visited.
Thank you so much. And I know Auckland Castle is on my list of places to go once we're allowed to, once lockdown restrictions are eased. So I do need to get up to Durham. And this kind of links into the final question I wanted to ask you, Lisa, was that when people are able to go out and visit these places, for those people who haven't been exploring Bishop's Palaces before, is there one that you would really recommend so that you go and see first before you go and explore others?
I think, well, I've said Wells already, but that is really good. And it feels, yeah, it feels medieval as well, because some of them have been kind of quite done over in later periods and have like the stuccoed rooms and all that kind of stuff. But Wells, you do get a kind of progression of the medieval spaces, and that is quite lovely, I think, and some good interpretation there as well.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Lisa. And thank you everyone for your questions. If I haven't answered them, I'm sorry, but keep commenting and I'll do my best to get answers to you. Now, next week, we are going to be joined by Andrew Zaminski. Now, Andrew's been doing a lot of work with us at the Church Conservation Trust. He's one of our conservators, and he's been working at one of our most recent vestings, and he launched a book last year called A Life in Ruins, and it's about his life as a stonemason. And we're going to be talking about his journey looking after one of our churches, as I said, is at Hemmington. So do join us next week when we go give you behind the scenes tour of some of the amazing traditional craft skills that we are keeping alive. Now, as I mentioned at the start of this lecture, if you missed last week's lecture with Dr. Alec Hamilton on arts and crafts churches, firstly, you can watch a recording of that for free of charge on Facebook or on YouTube. But if you wanted to buy a book and you found out that it sold out, don't worry, we got some more in. We've got less than 20 left in stock, though, I'm afraid. So if you'd like to get a copy, we'll post the link to our website. You can buy that on our website. The recommended retail price is £45, but we're selling it for £35, and all proceeds go to helping us care for historic churches. Finally, as we said at the start of the lecture, if you become a member with us, so from £3.50 a month, if you join by direct debit, use the code LECTURE, you will get sent three booklets about 3 historic churches on our case. You'll get a booklet on Cambridge All Saints, on St John on the Wall, Bristol, and Holy Trinity, York. Now, finally, thank you so much for all your feedback, everyone. It's been great to welcome so many people joining these lectures every single week, and it's a joy to communicate and share knowledge with you. So we're going to keep these going, but we really do value your feedback, and it's great to get constructive comments. And I know there have been issues about captions. We are looking into some options, but if you've got any feedback or anything at all, please do send us an email. You can email me at digital@thecct.org.uk, or you can send us a private Facebook message. But as I said, we really value your feedback. So do let us know if there's things we can do to improve them and sort of improve accessibility. And finally, also thank you for everyone who has emailed me already or sent messages for suggestions for future lectures. We're now fully booked up until July, I believe, and we've got plans already for the rest of the year. But keep your ideas coming, because what we'll do is we'll try and book them in for later on this year, or if not next year. So thank you so much, everyone. And thank you again, Lisa. We look forward to seeing everyone at a future lunchtime lecture.